Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. So, last week we left off by exploring the very first sentence, one of the misdeeds in this group of sentences here. So, last week we explained the misdeed of hoping that someone fails. Now, this group of sentences they come together, and hopefully you can see why. So not only is it a misdeed to hope that someone fails, to ruin someone's success, endanger others for one's safety, or impoverish others for one's own gain. So all of them have the common denominator of thinking of one's own interests to the detriment of others. But more importantly, you can see that all of these involve some kind of unkind thoughts. So they are all related to unkind, selfish thoughts. And this is very important because as soon as we have that thought, it's already a misdeed. So the Exalted Treatise is explaining to us that we don't necessarily have to actually do it or say anything. This thought may not necessarily translate into words or actions yet, but just having that thought in itself is a misdeed. So that's why the Exalted Treatise warns us against this. So these unkind thoughts are something we have to be very careful of. Now, it's interesting because where do these thoughts come from? In the Yogacara school of Buddhism, otherwise known as the consciousness-only school of Buddhism, talks about how humans have 51 different mental functions or states of mind. And there are obviously positive and negative, but actually there are more negative tendencies or states of mind than there are positive. When we talk about negative tendencies, we're talking about being unkind and selfish. So these would include things like greed and anger. And we are born with these. These are these innate tendencies that we have that we can't avoid. And by having these tendencies, these thoughts, whether it is, this greed, to hope that someone fails, or anger, etc., it will lead to misfortune. Because even though this is something that comes to us sometimes instinctively, sometimes we don't even think and we already feel some sort of jealousy or anger or greed, it's actually a misdeed. And this plants the seed for future misfortune. So misfortune is something that we cannot escape. It's unavoidable. And the reason is because in our minds, of course, we give rise to these negative thoughts. So you can see that why the sage teachings, these words of wisdom, these sacred texts are so important. It's through this education that we understand that we have these negative tendencies. It's through the education that we understand how to overcome them, and the need to focus on the positive tendencies, the kindness that is also innate to us, that we need to develop and grow that kindness, which we would generally call the whole process of cultivation, of developing ourselves, and realizing that actually we can overcome these negative tendencies. So Buddhism explains that actually the real self, the true self-nature, is something that doesn't think of ourselves. It's actually only positive. And this positivity encompasses or embodies everything, in the sense that the true self-nature embodies everyone and everything. That's a true us rather than the small me or the small self. a petty self that only thinks of this, only identifies this body as myself. And Buddhism explains that actually the true self is that of everything. That is the true self nature that we need to realize. So, in order to get there, we have to overcome the default tendency of just thinking of ourselves and therefore putting us at odds with others. And when we look at the three main Chinese traditions, so in Taoism here, in the Exalted Treatise, it talks about the transcendental being, the immortal. So someone who has overcome these sort of human negative tendencies. In Confucianism, it talks about a sage, and a sage is someone who is at one with heaven, earth, and all beings. And so the sage realizes they are that innate oneness. And similarly, Buddhism talks about enlightenment, realizing the true self-nature, which is this oneness with everything as well. So all the three traditions explain and teach us about this true state of being and how to get there, how to cultivate that. Because it's actually quite scary if you think about it. If without this kind of education, without cultivation, then every thought could be self-centered. And that would mean that our every thought would be a misdeed, which will more frightening, more, you'd say, on a more chilling level, that would mean that our every thought leads to some misfortune in the future. So we're actually creating misfortune in our every thought without this education. There's this in relation to this idea of hoping that someone fails. There's a very good story in the collected commentaries, and it's about an ambassador. His name is Li Shiheng, and him and his deputy, whose name is Yu Ying, travel to the Korean Peninsula. So they're on a mission. Obviously, they need to bring gifts. They also have their own personal belongings. And the ambassador entrusts his deputy with looking after all of the belongings and these gifts. Now, they have to travel by boat. And in those days, these ships were not very high tech, and it was very easy for water to come into the boat. Now, the deputy, who knows this, of course, is thinking only of himself. And he's thinking, well, if water gets into the boat, then it's going to be soaking the suitcases and everything. So in order to protect his own property, he puts the ambassadors, his boss's suitcases, cases, and property at the bottom. And he puts his on top of his boss's suitcase, which would then, he's thinking would ensure that it would be dry and it wouldn't be ruined. So he's only thinking of himself. Now, no one knew this because he was entrusted with taking care of all the property, and sort of he put it in there and he's probably the one to take it out, so no one would know. But what happens is that during the course of the journey, they encounter very stormy weather conditions. So between the choppy waves and the strong winds, the boat is almost about to capsize. And the captain makes the decision to start offloading cargo to lighten the weight of the ship and sort of prevent it from capsizing. So, without thinking, he sort of grabs anything that he can get his hands on and throws it overboard, these suitcases, etc., to ensure the safety of all passengers. And actually, this strategy works. So, the boat becomes more stable. Then, the winds die down. They pass through the stormy weather, and it becomes calm again. It's okay. Everyone is now safe. And in that period, they sort of want to see, what's happened, what property was actually thrown overboard. It turns out that all the suitcases and property that was thrown overboard was that of the deputy ambassador, the one who'd, put his suitcases on top of everyone else's, in the hopes that it would be dry and safe, and not damaged. But actually, it's his that it end up being tossed over. So he loses everything, in terms of his own property. So you can see that, by hoping that someone fails, that's already a misdeed, which then creates the, is the cause for future misfortune for oneself. And that's something that we have to really guard against. This misdeed of, wishing that others fail and taking delight in that is not only documented in the Exalted Treatise, in Buddhism, Confucianism, but actually it's also in other faiths. And you could say it is a universal phenomenon. Just take a look at the following painting here. It's a very interesting painting. What can you see? So on the right-hand side, or in the foreground of the painting, you see a monk. He's sort of pulling at a donkey that is sort of quite stubborn, sort of hard to control. So everything's sort of quite chaotic there. But look at everyone in the background around him. What are they doing? They're just laughing at him. No one's really helping. So this particular painting, from the 17th century sort of quite aptly depicts this phenomenon. In German, Schadenfreude, which is, if you look up the different components of that word, is to take joy or delight in another person's failures and losses. So just like the picture here, everyone's laughing, everyone's finding it funny, but no one's really helping. No one's really sympathizing with that monk, in sort of reaching out to give him a hand. So the thing with this particular state of mind, or you could call it an emotion, is that it's actually been well researched, and it doesn't just occur in, let's say, it occurs in groups, but also in individuals. So from the individual point of view, it's been seen that this kind of emotion occurs particularly when you see the failings of a rival or a competitor, because obviously if they are perhaps in a better position, because they have sustained losses, they're not such a strong competitor or rival anymore. But on the other hand, it also comes about, particularly in those with poor self-esteem or self-confidence, in the sense that a person with low self-esteem will look at the external factors and how other people are doing to sort of compare themselves against others. So if others are doing poorly, then they feel that actually it helps their reputation or their standing. Whereas someone who has high self-esteem, they're already very confident in their own talents, their own abilities, their knowledge, or they're very clear that they have to work on certain things and they're focusing on themselves, then that person is going to be less affected by other people, whether they succeed or fail, because they are confident in themselves. So they're not going to experience this emotion or this mental state as much. In other words, they will not commit this misdeed to the same extent as someone with poor self-esteem. So that's something that we need to reflect on, the idea that why that might be the case, is it, why do we look to others to establish our own self-worth when really that self-worth has objective criteria? in a particular job? Are we fulfilling our tasks? In a particular scholarship, if we're a student, are we meeting the learning outcomes and criteria? Are we sort of making progress in our education? There is specific criteria that we should evaluate ourselves against, as opposed to simply looking at others and comparing as to whether they're better or worse than us. So that's not a very good way of trying to develop yourself, first and foremost, but actually from a moral perspective, it's actually something that is detrimental to your own virtue. Now, we said, of course, that these negative traits, these negative tendencies are sometimes a default, and whether you're an adult or a young child, this kind of emotion has been observed, even in young children. So it's important to ask ourselves, when we see someone do good, what's our first thought? When we see someone encounter misfortune, do we sympathize with them? Or do we take delight in that? And, ultimately, then if the answer is that perhaps we do experience this kind of mental state, then the way around it is to think about how we would feel in their situation, to think from their perspective. So to overcome feeling delight or joy in someone else's failings, or even to hope for their failings, is to develop a mind of empathy. And that is what overcomes this negative tendency. And empathy is none other than putting yourself in their place, and thinking of them as you would think of yourself. Would I want to experience this? Would I want my family members to experience this? So that's really the first sentence, which we did cover a bit last week, but I guess that other sense of it as a misdeed, as a mental emotion, kind of mental state, wanted to explain further today. Now this brings us to the next sentence, the next misdeed, which is to ruin someone's success. Seems slightly similar, doesn't it? The difference between the first and the second sentence is that in the first case, you're hoping someone fails. They haven't succeeded. They're, working hard, and you hope that they don't accomplish what it is they set out to do, or you're hoping that maybe their project encounters some setbacks. Whereas in the second sentence, this particular sentence that we're going to talk about, it's about someone who's already had some success. They've already, there's an outcome already. What do? You hope that it's ruined. You ruin it. Now, this ruin is quite interesting, because actually if we look at the individual characters, this Chinese word can mean, literally destroy someone else's accomplishments, but also it can be to slander, to falsely sort of accuse someone, and with the intention of damaging their reputation, of harming their success. So it's an intentional thing. And you use these words, in terms of slander anyway, you use your words to try to undermine them. This ruining can be through our words, through our actions, obviously from this mental state, from this this thought itself. And you want to ruin their success or achievement, whether it's, a small achievement or a big achievement. I put this particular painting here. It's of the Roman Emperor Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and he is depicted here as sort of chopping off the heads of tall poppies. So there's a whole patch of these flowers. I mean, he's just chopping off the taller flowers. And I'm sure that many of you may have heard of this syndrome called the tall poppy syndrome. So what that means is that, you know, someone who is obviously quite successful, who is much better than us, then others will naturally feel jealous, or we feel jealous, and we want to cut them down. Cutting them down, not literally, but cutting them down as in, you know, ruining their reputation in some way, ruining their success, so that, you know, you bring them down, so they're not as successful anymore. As that's what we call the tall poppy syndrome. And again, that sort of points to this kind of universal human condition. It's not just something that the Exalted Treatise back in the 12th century observed and warned us against, but it's something that continues to happen to today. So this achievement and, you know, the idea of success is something that we all wish for. And whether you're a young child who wants to, you know, get better marks or make the sports team, or whether you are an adult who wants to get a promotion in your career, or you've got a project and you want to make sure that it's goes off quite smoothly, so that, you know, it's good for the organization. And regardless of whether it's work or at home, everyone wishes to achieve some sort of success in their endeavors, to have this achievement. Now, and particularly when we are trying to do something for the benefit of others, so say community projects. Now, we particularly hope that goes off quite smoothly. And we have to remember that this success, of course, is the sort of combined result of a combination of factors. Now, just to sort of draw out that principle of cause and effect, I'm going to explain it in a bit of detail. So the first thing is, the first most fundamental factor is planting that seed. So let's use the analogy of growing something. So the first thing is planting the seed, which is, in the case of, if you want to achieve something, if you want to have success, it's a good deed that you've performed, helping others, etc. If you can look back at the Exalted Treatise in that section on good deeds. So we have to plant that seed, whether it's in our thoughts, words, or actions. But actually, on top of that, there are other factors that we need. Like if we were to plant something, that seed would need nourishment, it would need sunshine, it would need water, rain, etc. So these are the other conditions, and there are multiple conditions. And then ultimately, over some time, we have to wait for it to flower and fruit, and for us to reap the rewards. And, you know, in the case of a good deed, that would be good fortune. Now, come back to that line about ruining someone's success. That, you know, if we were to ruin someone's success, it would be in the second stage, which is sort of providing unfavorable conditions, like a plant that is not being watered, that stays in a dark place, it has no sunshine, has no, you know, soil, for example. So creating those unfavorable circumstances for the other person through your slander or through your manipulations of the circumstances. But have a think about it. Does it actually stop the growth of that plant? Does it actually stop that person's success? The answer is no. It may delay the growth of the plant. Another thing I should point out is that these seeds are indestructible. So unlike, the seeds of, the human world, that can be, can be spoiled or rotten, the seeds that we plant through our thoughts, words, and actions, whether they are good deeds or misdeeds, they're indestructible. And they have to encounter certain factors to mature and ultimately lead to the consequences. Now, by providing unfavorable conditions, by trying to ruin someone's success, you're just actually temporarily obstructing them, really delaying or postponing their success. For the other person, it's a temporary setback, but it doesn't eliminate the good deed that they did in the very first place. It doesn't eradicate or destroy that seed. We think about the analogy. And Venerable Master explains that it could be, a number of years, even up to 10 years. But ultimately, it will happen. The success will come about. The person will experience good fortune. And the hindering or the obstructing that we try to do, we are, in the mind of ruining their success, it doesn't actually work. In fact, it may actually help them because it helps them develop resilience, to be stronger as a person, to come back and, survive the unfavorable circumstances. Because at the end of the day, if they have planted that seed, and that seed is indestructible, these karmic seeds, they will reap the rewards. It's just a matter of time. In other words, if we find ourselves in unfavorable circumstances, if we are the victim of someone else's slander or, their scheming, does it mean that they've stopped us? And the answer is no. Because we have created the causes, we've done the good deeds in the past, it's just a matter of waiting it out, overcoming this challenge, developing our resilience, and ensuring that we continue to do good deeds, and then ultimately the conditions will be right for the good fortune to be experienced. So you can see that the most important thing is the very first part, isn't it? Planting the seed, performing the good deeds, making sure that we are consistent in that, or whatever the circumstances. And it's only a matter of time before the conditions change and they become favorable and we are able to experience the good fortune from our good deeds. So the reality is that if someone has performed a good deed, then we should praise and congratulate them, really celebrate them. And that is, in that way, it develops our virtue. It means that we are constantly accumulating merits, but more importantly, this virtue is breaking down the barriers between us and others, breaking down the barriers so that we can ultimately work towards enlightenment, towards becoming a sage. And, the other thing is, if we simply sort of accord with our negative tendencies and hinder others, slander them, or encourage or help others with misdeeds, then that in itself is a misdeed. So really, you could say it's a split-second decision at times, to either do the right thing or the wrong thing in our minds before then, the words come out. It's either words of praise or slander. That state of mind is so important. To really understand the consequences. I mean, this sounds quite simple, but to understand the consequences of our actions in ruining someone else's success, we need to think about what would have happened had they actually accomplished what they set out to do. So let's take, for example, the person wants to establish a school, and this particular school wants to, it's a very good school that focuses on character education, and not only the normal subjects but actually developing the character of these students. Now, if for some reason this person has been slandered, they're no longer able to carry out that project, can you imagine the consequences? So first of all, how many people would have benefited from the school itself? It's not just really the students, is it? Let's say that the students, they learned from the school, they developed very good understanding of virtue, they're honest people, they go out into the communities later in their life, in their work, and really help others. Then you can see that it's not just the student that has benefited, but actually other people that they have helped in their lives. And maybe it's not just this particular person, the student, but their families, the next generation. So in terms of the duration of the benefit, is it just, the here and now, this particular, the benefit is only to that particular person over a few weeks, or is it something that might cause benefit to people over generations? And so that's the duration, but on top of that, the scope of the impact. Is it just in this community, or is it something that could have international recognition and impact? So if it's the fact that the impact is, going to be quite extensive, and also over a long period of time, then the misfortune, the misdeed that has been accumulated, the demerits, and ultimately the misfortune that will be experienced will be quite severe, will be quite serious. Even though it may have only taken the actual misdeed itself, the slandering, may have taken just 5 minutes or a few sentences to say a few words to someone who's quite influential and tell them that, this is not a good idea, this person is not very good, they shouldn't establish a school. It gets shut down. The actual misdeed may not have taken very long or much effort, or it could have been even, unintentional in the sense that you just experience this jealousy and you just say those words without even thinking. But because of the impact of those words is quantified not by the time that it took that person to slander or the effort it took them to slander, but actually is quantified by the impact of the benefits that were lost to the amount of people and the time frame. You can see that actually it's something that's very serious. It's not something that should be taken lightly. And as I mentioned before, it's just sometimes a split-second decision that we make. That, okay, I see something good and therefore I'm very happy about it, or, I feel jealous and therefore these words come out without me even thinking, these negative tendencies. So we constantly have to evaluate our thoughts. Should I be thinking this? Should I be saying this? Should I be doing this? There's a very famous scholar and scholar official of the 12th century. His name is Jin De Xiu. He has this quite famous quote. He says, "When hearing of another's good deeds, we should praise and congratulate them. We should celebrate them, really rejoice with them, take delight in their good deeds. And when hearing of another's misdeeds, we have to conceal it so that they can continue to succeed in the future. And this is what will maintain our moral excellence." So if we analyze this a bit further, the first idea is something that we've just been talking about, that it's important that When we hear of someone's good deeds, we should rejoice in that. We should be happy for them. And that actually multiplies the good deeds. Why? Even just this one thought of being happy with someone's good deeds actually not only benefits yourself, but also it benefits the person who's done the good deeds. They feel encouraged. They'll work harder. They will continue to do so. It benefits yourself because you've learned from their good deeds. You want to emulate them. You've recognized that this is a good thing. But it also benefits everyone around you who hears of your praise and your congratulation, because then they will recognize that, oh, this is something good that I should emulate too. This is something good that I should be doing. So you've benefited everyone, and therefore the merits are multiplied. When you hear of someone's misdeeds, their faults, things that they've done wrong, then we shouldn't speak of it, gossip about it, spread it to others, even if it might be the truth. So let alone, slandering someone, which is obviously, false words. But why is it important to conceal it? Is that it gives them a chance to change. And perhaps, they may have actually realized their mistakes and they're trying to correct it. And they should be given that time and space, an opportunity to correct it, rather than simply being further criticized and perhaps lose their job, so they can never really change. Obviously, if you are in a position to suggest to the other person, give them some sort of ways in which they can help improve themselves because you're a good friend and you have that person's trust, then that's something that you should do. But that would be in a private setting where you're just talking to the other person one-to-one, and not sort of embarrassing them around everyone else. So that's what it means by conceal. It doesn't mean ignore. It means being aware of it, seeing how you can help that person, but not sort of gossiping about them behind their back and ensuring that they have a really bad reputation, because everyone can change, and it's just ensuring that we allow people that opportunity. And if they can, then that is actually a merit on our part. And so he says that, with these two ways of reacting and responding to others, their good deeds and their misdeeds, then we ourselves will maintain our moral excellence. So this maintain moral excellence is important, preserves the virtue that we have by recognizing the good and the bad in others, emulating the good and avoiding the bad. But on top of that, we actually have to do it. We have to do good works in order to really develop our moral excellence. This is simply to maintain our moral excellence, to ensure that it doesn't deteriorate. But we actually have to put in the hard work ourselves to fully cultivate and develop ourselves. Interestingly, in Buddhism, it talks about rejoicing in another person's merits, which in Mandarin is 随喜功德, which is something that you would say, if you hear about someone who's done a good deed, you would say 随喜功德, which is really happy for you. And with that expression, the other person feels encouraged, you feel happy, you really celebrate that with the other person, and that develops both merits on both sides, as we explained before. So the merits are multiplied. Now, coming back to the idea of merits, demerits, good fortune and misfortune, if you are in a position at this state in time in which you are experiencing some sort of unhappiness, suffering, or misfortune in any way. It could even be that your family member is suffering some misfortune. Then what's the way out? the way out is to simply plant these good seeds, these good deeds, to continue doing good and not doubting. The suffering that we experience now is the consequence of the misdeeds that we've done and we've committed in the past. Okay, so we can't escape that. Because it's something that these seeds that have already been planted, it's just a matter of time before they, as we said, flower and fruit. So we experience the consequences. But the problem is that, we experience these consequences and we're further ignorant, in the sense that we start to doubt the idea of the law of cause and effect. We might blame others, thinking that it's their fault rather than our own. And actually, that then creates more misdeeds, and therefore leads to more suffering. So the only way out is, even in times of trouble, to think about doing good, to think of others rather than oneself. And this is, being compassionate, thinking of others, and put yourself in their shoes regardless of your situation, and, as we said, accord with the standards in these sacred works. Ultimately, rejoice in others' merits regardless of where you are. And this rejoicing is not only praising or encouraging them, but even contributing resources, time and energy to help them along. So it's quite multifaceted, this idea of, being happy in someone else's good deeds. So now we move on to the next two lines that, we can see they're quite related. Again, it's about the idea of thinking of yourself only and not caring about the other person. The first one is endangering others. So if we look on a word-by-word sort of analysis, sort of putting others in a difficult or dangerous situation. Why? Is because you want to be in the safer or the more stable position. Now, very good story in the collected commentaries was about Li Shu. And he was a sort of local government official, sort of the head of a district, his own jurisdiction. And he received some intel, sort of intelligence to tell him that there was increasing rebel activity. So in those days, sometimes the civil order was threatened by, you could say, bandits, but also certain rebels. So he heard that they were coming towards his particular district, and there would be increasing numbers. And obviously, the first person that they would attack would be the leader, because the leader has the most power, most resources, property, and that's what they want to get hold of in order to control the whole area themselves. So he knew that this was this was an approaching imminent kind of danger. What did he do? Try to think of a way to escape. And he couldn't just leave his position. So what he did was he recommended a friend to take over his role. Now, his friend had no idea about this specific intelligence, about the fact that there were rebels on their way. And so his friend was quite happy and took over the position. His whole family moved in, and Li Shu was able to leave. Now, as expected, the rebels came and they ended up killing his friend and the entire family. But Li Shu, who actually sort of found another position in a different district, on his travels to his next position, he himself encountered the same fate. He encountered rebels or bandits, and they actually killed his entire family, and he also lost his life. So classic example of someone trying to endanger others and thinking that they will be safe. The other option would be to stand his ground, find out if there were other resources that he could use to defend himself and his community, and perhaps talk to other district governors to see if they could help out. There were a number of strategies that a number of different solutions that he could have taken, and instead he sort of just thinks of himself. Now, for us, of course, in our daily lives, it's we don't often encounter sort of life-threatening kind of danger, but this particular sentence could be applied if we have a difficult or high-risk kind of task, or even if it's an embarrassing task. And oftentimes we want to just shift it to someone else, pass the buck, and give the work to someone else, so that we are not in that high-risk position. So this is something that might happen in our jobs. And again, I would encourage you to think of other opportunities, other sort of solutions to the problem. What else can you do if you're given a task that is beyond your capabilities? It's really too difficult, and also high risk. Well, take the time and effort to think about a better solution for everyone in the organization. Perhaps there are people who do have the resources, who do have the capabilities. Perhaps there are, we could form a team and do it together. Perhaps there's other things that you need to train yourself on, to upskill yourself so that you can do a better job. So there are many different solutions, and it's a matter of taking the time to do so rather than the instinctive response being to palm it off to someone, and regardless of whether that person is able to take on that role or not. They could be an inexperienced junior and you're just throwing it to them so that you don't get the blame if it all fails. So the thing here is this endanger is actually just sort of shifting the responsibilities that might be difficult, embarrassing, high risk, dangerous to others without thinking about the greater good. So the other way is to think about, okay, what makes this dangerous? How can we alleviate this? What can we do? What resources do we have? How can I upskill myself? How can I train myself so that I can better manage this? And take that time and effort to think about all the different solutions and consult others as well, rather than simply escaping. The next one is similar in the sense that it's about taking advantage of others, enriching others, profiting or enriching oneself at the expense of others. And this is a very common misconception that one can actually take advantage of others. That from understanding the law of cause and effect, this causality, you can see that that's actually impossible. The little that we gain from taking advantage of others, where does that come from? Where does that good fortune come from? Well, thinking back to what we talked about in the analogy of planting a seed, well, this good fortune that we've experienced is actually the result of a good deed that we have performed in the past. Might have even been in our past lives. We may not have any recollection of it, but that's a reason why, even though we might be taking advantage of someone, we are committing a misdeed here and now, we do experience this good fortune. It's not because we've actually taken advantage of them and therefore achieved good fortune. And by taking advantage of them, this is planting the seed for the misdeed, planting the seed for future misfortune. All of it is really creating our own suffering at the end of the day. There's a very good story that I will end with today. And it's about Mr. Liu Yingnan, who lived in the Jiangxi province in China. He was a merchant, a businessman. And in this particular story, he's just had done some trades, business in a different province, in the Fujian province. And this particular project was very profitable. Sort of finishing up, he travels back home. All his profits are stored up in a case. But unfortunately, on the way, this case gets stolen. And Mr. Liu is quite shocked. He's quite distraught. And he just cries out, actually, this case is not my own money, but actually it contains 200 gold pieces that Mr. Mao entrusted me with. And I'm meant to be taking it back to give to him. So, now that my case is lost, what am I going to do? So he sort of, in his shock and his desperation, he sort of cries out. He's really not sure what to do, that the case has been stolen. And the people around him who hear this, they take it on themselves to pursue the thieves, and to the extent that the thieves actually abandon the case. So the thieves leave the case on the ground, make off, and the people take the case and give it back to this Mr. Liu. When he opens the case, he's overjoyed. He finds that there's 200 gold pieces. He says, "Oh, this is excellent. I can actually return this to my friend." But people, the crowds are asking him, so, how much was actually in the case? And he replies that actually he lost 400 gold pieces. So the total that was in the case was 600 gold pieces. 200 was his friend, 400 was his own, the profits from that, this particular business venture. And but actually he's just overjoyed because he's only thinking about giving it back to his friend. And this is really, really interesting, isn't it? Because if you think about it, there were 3 options he could have taken. The first option is that he could have just told his friend that everything was stolen. And, unfortunately, your money's gone. And, it was not my fault. He could have just taken the 200 gold pieces as his own, because in fact he had 400 in the case. The second would be to have divided the 200 pieces according to how much was in the case. So 1/3 for his friend, 2/3 for himself, and told his friend the truth that everything was stolen. There's only 200 left. Therefore, we're going to take our fair share. Unfortunately, can't get back the rest. But he took the third option, which was that he gave all 200 gold pieces for his friend and cut his own losses, and didn't think about the 400. In fact, he said to the crowds that probably, it wasn't meant to be his in the first place, so therefore it's taken. Sort of believed in this idea of cause and effect. So what he ends up doing is, cutting his losses. But actually that year, his turnover was much better than expected, and in fact made up for more than what he had lost. So his profit that year was more than 400 gold pieces. So in a way, he gets it all back. What's meant to be his ends up coming back to him. Now, that's not the end of the story. Actually, 8 years later, a fellow merchant from the same town as Mr. Liu, is out for business and suddenly falls ill. And this is a very acute, very serious illness. And Mr. Liu goes to see him. At the same time, all his other business creditors people he's owed debts to also coming. Once they heard the news, they come and they see if there's any way that they can get their money back, while he's on his deathbed. Because in those days, of course, someone's property would ultimately go on to their family. If they hadn't had the time to write a will to explain that X goes to all of this money that all the debts have to be paid off, then perhaps their family could say that the money is all theirs, and these debtors would get none of it. So everyone is sort of trying to find a way to get their money back while he's still alive. He's on his deathbed. And in fact, Mr. Liu, this Liu Yingnan, happens to be the largest creditor, most compared to everyone else that's there. And as everyone's just squabbling and sort of trying to decide what to do, he sort of takes a stand and says, look, the man is gravely sick. And, here we are just sort of trying to find ways to get our money back. If we do succeed in getting it back, maybe, he'll die from the shock of losing all his property. And, that might tip the scale and he passes away. And that's really going to be on our conscience, isn't it? So let's give him the time to, see if he gets well before we continue this conversation. And because he was the largest creditor, I guess no one had anything else to say. And actually, the good news was that his friend did get better, and his friend recovered, was very grateful that he sort of quelled the conflict and squabbling, and wanted to give him his money back. But Mr. Liu actually said to his friend, don't worry, this can wait. We can talk about it another day. And seeing that he had recovered, he leaves that town. Now, because of course he was a wealthy merchant, and people had thought that he was coming to collect that debt, there were actually some thieves that were waiting to ambush him. And when they corner him, they actually find that he has nothing on him. And because of this, they spare his life. Whereas if he had taken the money and collected the very large sum of money, that large debt that he'd been owed, maybe they would have taken his money and also his life. So Mr. Liu actually, because of that, because of this generosity of spirit that he has, thinking about his friend, he actually comes out alive. And you can see the consistency in this Mr. Liu, his attitude to life. Not only is it when, in the first instance, he loses everything, but but he's thinking only of his friend. The 200 gold pieces goes to his friend. Here, in the second story, we hear that his friend is another friend, and he's thinking about his friend's health over and above his debts, whereas everyone is just thinking about insisting on their rights to this property and trying to claim it back before it gets lost. But you can see that by doing so, at every moment, even in these desperate times, when he's lost everything, his first thought is not to take advantage of the situation and take advantage of others for one's own personal gain, but his first thought is to think of others. And with that, you can see, despite the many set, you could say, challenges, he overcomes each of these challenges quite easily. The thieves, for example, getting a better business turnover, so that that particular year he basically ends up with over 400 gold pieces that had been lost. So all of these things, this good fortune, it's not an accident. It's not coincidental. So-called good luck. Nothing happens by chance or by luck or by accident. It's actually something that we have, is the consequence or the result of what we've done through our thoughts, words, and actions. So good deeds result in rewards, good fortune. Misdeeds will be punished. It will result in misfortune and suffering. So if we are able to fully understand that principle, that really changes how we see things, how we do things. And even in times of desperation, in times of suffering, we will still do the right thing because we know that that's the only way to get us out of this misfortune. Okay, so given the time, we'll have to end there today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.